On first glance, it looks like a routine consumer choice. The same type of projector, similar product photos, similar specifications. One listing costs a few hundred USD on Temu, the other costs twice as much in a European online store. In the marketing copy, both devices promise home cinema, smart features, and high resolution. Only the price and the logo seem to differ. But this is not a story about a brand. It is a story about two parallel trading systems. Because the modern projector is no longer the product of a single company. It is the output of a global mechanism. OEM factories, e-commerce platforms, logistical infrastructure, and cost policy operating in concert. The same device can reach a customer through two radically different routes, one direct, fast, and cheap, the other longer, more expensive, and wrapped in institutional safeguards. From the outside, it resembles competition between stores. In reality, it is competition between economic models. The platform model, embodied by Temu and AliExpress, compresses the supply chain to its bare minimum: factory, algorithm, customer. The price falls, the risk shifts to the user. Consumer electronics becomes fast-moving, semi-disposable consumption. The European model builds protective layers: importer, warehousing, service network, warranty enforcement, legal accountability within a local jurisdiction. The price rises, the comfort rises, the predictability rises. This episode does not answer the question of where it is better to buy. It answers something more consequential: what you are actually purchasing when you choose one path over the other. Because in an era of globalized production, buying a projector is no longer merely a technical decision. It is a systemic decision, an implicit vote for price versus security, speed versus stability, algorithmic distribution versus institutional markets. And somewhere in the middle of it all stands the same factory, producing the same hardware. That is where the real story of cheap home cinema begins. Temu does not operate like a store, it operates like infrastructure. The distinction is subtle, yet fundamental, and it reshapes how low-cost electronics enters European living rooms. Traditional commerce relied on physical points of friction and control. Wholesalers, regional warehouses, retail chains, storefronts, sales staff, local distributors. Every layer added cost, but it also added responsibility, oversight, and quality control. Temu strips most of that away. It leaves the factory, the algorithm, and the customer. In this model, it is not the seller who decides what you see. It is the recommendation system. A projector no longer competes with another projector on the shelf next to it. It competes with dozens of unrelated items in an endless scroll: headphones, LED lamps, power banks, toys. Visibility is not awarded for technical excellence. It is awarded for performance within the platform's mechanics, click-through rates, conversion probabilities, and price sensitivity. Price stops being a straightforward reflection of production cost. It becomes an algorithmic instrument. One day the projector costs 300 zloty, the next 450, the third day 320 again. Not because component prices changed overnight, but because the platform is testing the market's reaction. This is dynamic commerce governed by data, not the stable pricing logic of a shop. Temu reinforces that mechanism by subsidizing logistics. It offsets shipping costs, accelerates delivery windows, and internalizes part of the transport expense. The goal is not necessarily profit on a single item. The goal is behavioral capture, conditioning customers to believe electronics should be cheap, fast, and available in one click. For OEM factories, this is close to an ideal arrangement. Instead of negotiating with importers, retail chains, and regional brands, they can plug directly into platform-driven demand. Mass production meets mass distribution. Scale begins to self-propel. But the model also changes the customer's relationship with the product. The projector stops being an AV purchase. It becomes an impulse buy, something added to the basket next to USB cables and small gadgets. Electronics loses its status as a durable good. it begins to behave like seasonal merchandise. In this world, responsibility is dispersed. The platform sells access. The factory produces the device. The courier delivers the parcel. When something goes wrong, the customer enters a maze of forms, bots, and automated procedures. Formally, everything works. Practically, accountability dissolves across systems. That is the hidden price of the low price. Temu does not merely sell projectors. It rewires consumer expectations. It teaches that electronics does not need to be expensive. It does not need to be repaired. It does not need to last for years. It needs to work now. And this new model becomes the foundation of the cheap home cinema market. Without Temu and similar platforms, OEM would not reach this scale. Without OEM, Temu would have nothing to feed its algorithms. This feedback loop creates a new market architecture, one in which the physical store ceases to be the distribution center, and an Asian factory warehouse becomes the launch point for a European living room. To understand the full scope of the shift, however, you have to follow what happens next, the journey of the parcel itself, the transcontinental bloodstream of the system. That brings us to the next stage. Clicking Buy Now does not activate an online shop. It activates a logistical chain stretched across half the planet. The projector that arrives at a European door a few days later begins its trip in China's industrial zones, in technology parks, assembly halls, and consolidation centers built explicitly to serve mass e-commerce. The first step is not shipping. It is aggregation. Hundreds of thousands of orders from platforms like Temu are pooled in logistical hubs, where parcels are labeled, sorted by destination region, and consolidated into transport units. This stage determines the viability of the entire system. The more shipments can be bundled, the lower the unit cost becomes. From there, goods move to seaports or air cargo hubs. Ocean freight is slower but extraordinarily cheap per unit. Air freight is more expensive, but it is deployed aggressively during promotions where delivery time becomes part of the marketing promise. Platforms toggle between these channels dynamically, depending on sales campaigns and capacity across the network. On the European side, the next phase begins. Containers arrive at ports and distribution centers, where bulk transport is broken into individual shipments. Parcels pass through customs procedures, increasingly streamlined through scale, automation, and standardized declarations. This is not manual inspection of every item. It is a high-throughput flow of data, risk scoring, and automated clearance. Only then does the parcel enter national courier networks. And here lies a paradox. The last mile is often the most expensive portion of the chain. This is precisely where platforms engage in the most aggressive subsidization. They absorb delivery costs, negotiate wholesale rates, and distribute the expense across the entire system's scale. The result looks like a logistical miracle. A projector produced thousands of kilometers away reaches your door cheaper, sometimes, than a domestic delivery. But the miracle is not magic. It is optimization. A cost structure tuned so precisely that it only works at massive volume. This model is transforming global trade itself. Ports, cargo airports, and sorting centers are no longer built solely around classic wholesale flows. They are becoming the circulatory system of retail commerce. Millions of individual parcels replace pallets and shipments once destined for store networks. In that sense, Temu and similar platforms are not merely shopping apps. They are operators of global logistical infrastructure. They manage goods flows at a scale that a decade ago belonged to the largest retail chains and state postal systems. And that is where the next layer emerges, because this infrastructure is not politically neutral. It is tied to trade policy, implicit subsidies, and a strategic export interest. That takes us to the next act. The mass influx of low-cost electronics into Europe is not simply an outcome of free markets. It is the consequence of a long-term industrial and trade strategy that China has been executing for decades. Projectors, power banks, earbuds, and hundreds of other consumer products are not merely commodities today. They are instruments of economic expansion. China has invested heavily in production infrastructure. special economic zones, ports, rail, cargo airports, logistics centers. In parallel, it cultivated an OEM ecosystem capable of scaling output to millions of units at short notice. This did not happen spontaneously. It was enabled by industrial policy, subsidized energy, tax advantages, cheap industrial land, and privileged access to finance. The result is straightforward. Chinese factories can produce faster and cheaper than much of their global competition. And e-commerce platforms have become the digital extension of that advantage. Temu, AliExpress, and similar systems are not just private technology firms. They sit inside a broader export architecture. They enable direct access to end consumers, bypassing traditional distribution barriers, local importers, and classic retail networks. The balance of power shifts. Instead of fighting for contracts with European distributors, Chinese factories sell directly into foreign markets. Instead of negotiating shelf space, they fight for algorithmic visibility. Instead of television ads, they use app-based promotions and behavioral targeting. This is a new form of soft power, one that does not rely on culture, film, or public diplomacy, but on consumer infrastructure. Millions of European households use devices made in China every day. Even if they barely notice, they are participating in a Chinese-centered technology ecosystem. The dependency is subtle, yet real. European markets gradually normalize low-cost Asian electronics. Price expectations compress downward. Local producers struggle to compete on cost. The pricing pressure radiates across the entire consumer electronics sector. At the same time, the Chinese state does not need to wage an overt consumer-level trade war. It only needs to preserve infrastructural advantage. Subsidized logistics, low-cost production, and platform access do the rest. That is why cheap projectors are not just gadgets. They are pieces in a global economic puzzle. Every parcel shipped to Europe is a microtransaction that strengthens Asian production chains at the expense of local commercial structures. But the strategy has limits. Trade tensions rise, regulatory measures follow, customs enforcement, VAT regimes, consumer safety rules, data protection requirements, environmental standards. Europe begins to ask an uncomfortable question. Has it become too dependent on an imported infrastructure of cheap consumer goods? And here we arrive at a central contrast in this story. The collision between platform commerce and Europe's institutional market model, slower, more expensive, yet governed by a fundamentally different logic of responsibility. The European market was not designed for the Temu model. It was designed for institutional trade, importers, wholesalers, retail chains, legal accountability, and local tax systems. This clash is not simply a business dispute, it is a conflict of economic philosophies. In Europe's model, every product has an accountable party. Someone must guarantee compliance, safety, warranty enforcement, service, recycling obligations. The seller is not merely a conduit. The seller is a legal entity that carries risk. Platform commerce blurs that structure. The product comes from an OEM factory. The nominal seller may be an anonymous entity registered outside EU jurisdiction. The platform intermediates, but does not always assume full legal responsibility. The customer receives a parcel, a tracking number, and terms of service written for global e-commerce. This creates systemic friction. Europe attempts to regain control through regulation, VAT requirements for non-EU shipments, tighter conformity certification, stronger consumer protection rules, more stringent data standards. The objective is to force platforms to carry greater responsibility for the sellers operating on their infrastructure. But platforms adapt faster than regulators. They open logistics hubs within the EU. They register subsidiaries. They automate clearance. They shift formal points of responsibility without altering the core business model. It begins to resemble an arms race. Every new rule produces a new compliance architecture. Every attempt to seal the market produces new intermediary layers that preserve low prices. European retailers are squeezed. They pay taxes locally. They maintain warehouses. They fund service networks. They comply with environmental and consumer regulations, and yet they compete against listings operating under a radically different cost regime. The outcome is visible. Traditional retail loses margin. Assortments shrink. Low-end segments are abandoned because competing against subsidized logistics becomes economically irrational. In practice, Europe is not only importing projectors, it is importing a model of consumption, one in which electronics becomes cheap, fast, replaceable, and detached from local service ecosystems. This produces long-term strategic questions. Does Europe want to be merely a consumption market for low-cost electronics? Does it want to rebuild its own production chains? Does it want to impose a new responsibility framework on platform commerce? So far, the answers are partial. Policymakers speak about digital sovereignty. Regulators draft new directives. Platforms keep growing. And in the middle of it all stands the consumer, facing what looks like a simple choice: cheap and fast, or expensive and safe. Which brings us back to the underlying question that defines the cheap home cinema market. How do these system-level tensions shape the product itself, its quality, its durability, and its engineering logic? In the low-cost projector market, engineering does not begin with the question, how do we build the best image? It begins with a different question. What is the maximum the finished product can cost? Only then does the design take shape. Price is no longer the output of the design is the output of the price. This is a fundamental shift in electronics manufacturing philosophy. Once, companies designed devices and then calculated their cost. Today, an OEM receives a target budget, $100, $80, sometimes less, and designs an entire architecture within that constraint. Every component becomes a strategic trade-off. A better lens might mean a weaker processor, more RAM might mean cheaper cooling, a quieter fan might mean lower LED brightness. Nothing is incidental, everything is compromise. Platform pressure functions like an invisible regulator. The algorithm rewards the lowest price and the highest click volume. Factories learn that a 350 zloty model will sell 10 times more than a 500 zloty model, even if it is objectively inferior. Scale begins to matter more than performance. This produces standardization of mediocrity. Projectors start to look alike. The same chipsets, similar LCD modules, identical LED engines, the same motherboard layouts. Differences become cosmetic. Housing design, model name, marketing copy, while the underlying platform remains largely the same. Not because producers cannot build better, because the market has been trained not to pay for better. This becomes a feedback loop. Consumers normalize low prices. Platforms promote the cheapest listings. OEMs cut costs further. Quality stabilizes at the level of good enough. But the pressure has another, less obvious effect. It forces efficiency engineering. Low-cost projectors become optimized for power consumption. Circuits become simpler. Software becomes lighter. Operating systems are trimmed to run on minimal resources. This is not luxury technology. It is mass technology tuned for scale. A new category emerges: algorithmic electronics, products designed not for the premium user, but for platform mechanics. Hardware that must be cheap, rotate quickly, generate clicks, and remain within a statistically acceptable return rate. In that world, durability stops being the primary objective. What matters is whether the device survives the warranty period and the basic consumption cycle. Longevity becomes a bonus, not a standard. That does not mean OEMs build junk. It means they build devices optimized for mass-market economics, functional, serviceable, but not designed for decades of use. This is why cheap projectors trigger such polarized reactions. For some, they are technological miracles at the price point. For others, they are symbols of declining quality. In reality, they are mirrors of a market that imposed the terms of their existence. The technical story may now be complete, but one element is often missing from the conversation: the environmental and civilizational cost of the model, because cheap electronics carries a price you will not see on the receipt. When a customer sees a projector for a few hundred zloty with free shipping, they do not see container vessels, sorting centers, transshipment warehouses, and hundreds of kilometers of last-mile delivery. They see only price. Yet the global infrastructure of cheap electronics functions like an industrial circulatory system, pumping goods across oceans, through airports, onto highways, producing an environmental footprint that no single transaction is forced to account for. Platform commerce depends on volume. Millions of parcels move simultaneously. Each one is small, light, and seemingly insignificant. Together, they become a flow that burdens cargo aviation, container ports, and courier networks. In practice, it means more fuel consumption, higher emissions, and greater infrastructural stress than classic wholesale trade, where goods moved in bulk to one warehouse and were distributed locally afterward. Cheap electronics also reshapes product life cycles. A projector bought impulsively is less likely to be repaired and more likely to be replaced. When repair costs approach the price of a new unit, the decision becomes predictable. The device ends up in a drawer, a basement, or the e-waste stream. This produces a new class of waste, short-cycle electronics, devices that could function longer but are rendered economically irrational to repair. It strains recycling systems. Many low-cost projectors are not designed for easy disassembly. Modules are glued, casings snap-sealed, components difficult to separate. Recycling becomes expensive, labor-intensive, and often unprofitable. Some devices end up in landfill pathways or informal disposal channels. Platform commerce also exports environmental responsibility. The factory produces, the platform distributes, the courier delivers, but disposal costs are borne by the importing country's waste management and recycling systems. This is an asymmetry of accountability. The region that benefits from low-cost manufacturing does not necessarily bear the full ecological cost of its downstream consequences. At the same time, the model reshapes consumer culture. Electronics ceases to be a technological possession to be maintained. It becomes semi-disposable, seasonal, promotional, replaced at the next sale. This is not a minor shift. It is a structural cultural change, from durability to rotation, from repair to replacement, from responsibility to convenience. And here lies the paradox. Platforms present low prices as democratization, widening access to technology. Yet the same mechanism produces environmental pressure that someone must absorb: waste, emissions, strained infrastructure. Cheap home cinema is not just a device category. It is a component of a larger system that pushes costs outside the consumer's immediate field of vision. At this point, the story stops being only about projectors. It becomes a story about the kind of economy and the kind of society we are willing to sustain. Which brings us to the final question. Not which projector you should buy, but what market model you want to help build. At the end of this story, the projector is not the main character. The decision is a decision that looks trivial. Click Buy Now or pay more in a local store. In practice, it is a choice between two models of the world. The first model promises speed, low prices, and instant access. It is built on platform infrastructure, OEM mass production, and subsidized logistics. It delivers technology faster than any previous era. But it shifts costs beyond the phone screen, onto the environment, onto recycling systems, onto local retail ecosystems, onto product longevity. The second model is slower, more expensive, and less dramatic. It is anchored in institutions, regulations, legal accountability, and local distribution chains. It offers greater predictability, service, warranties, enforceable consumer rights. But it requires accepting a higher price as the cost of stability. Both worlds will coexist. Neither will disappear. Cheap home cinema is neither the salvation of technology nor the collapse of civilization. It is a symptom of an era in which accessibility has begun to outrun durability, and the algorithm has replaced the salesperson. The projector is no longer merely an AV device. It is a product of global systems of production, logistics, and consumption. When we buy it, we are no longer choosing only image parameters. We are choosing the market logic we reward. And perhaps that is the most important change of the last decade. Not that technology became cheaper, but that every purchase became a micro-vote for a particular economic order. The next time you see a projector for a few hundred zloty with free shipping, it may be worth asking one question. Not, is it a good deal? But, what story is this device bringing into my home? Because in the era of globalized production, even the cheapest gadget carries its own geopolitics, its own logistics, and its own cost, one that never appears on the price tag. And that, ultimately, is what modern home cinema has become.